Olivia, a 14-year-old orphan struggling to care for her dying foster mother, never expected a chance encounter to change her life forever. After saving Jessica, the daughter of a wealthy woman, from a vicious attack, Olivia is drawn into a world of wealth and privilege, only to uncover shocking secrets buried in her own past. Olivia sat on the worn-out couch of her foster home, staring blankly at the television. The noise filled the room, but she wasn't paying attention. At 14, Olivia had already learned that life didn't offer much comfort. The chipped walls of the small house and the musty smell that lingered in the air were constants, as was the quiet, except for the soft wheezing that came from the bedroom down the hall. That wheezing belonged to Ruth, her foster mother, who had been battling cancer for the past year. The sickness had drained Ruth of her energy, leaving her bedbound and dependent on Olivia for everything. Olivia didn't mind taking care of Ruth. After all, it was the least she could do. Ruth had been the only person to show her any real kindness since Olivia had entered the foster system years ago. But the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Olivia's thin shoulders. She woke up early each day, prepared Ruth's medicine, cleaned the house, and went to school. After school, she would stop by the pharmacy to pick up any new prescriptions or supplies before heading straight back home. There was no time for friends, not that Olivia had many. She was used to being alone, drifting from one foster home to another before Ruth had taken her in. Ruth was different from the others. She never yelled, never complained, and always treated Olivia with a quiet respect that made her feel seen. But now, Ruth was fading, and Olivia could see it in the way her skin had turned pale, almost translucent, and how her voice had grown weaker by the day. Each time Olivia entered Ruth's room, the air felt heavier, filled with a silent dread that no one spoke about. The doctors had told Ruth there wasn't much more they could do. Olivia overheard this during one of Ruth's hospital visits. The thought of losing her only source of stability terrified her, but Olivia kept her fear hidden. She had to be strong for Ruth, just as Ruth had been strong for her. "Olivia?" Ruth's frail voice called from the back room. Olivia quickly got up and entered the room, where Ruth lay propped up on pillows, her face drawn and tired. "Yes, Ruth?" Olivia asked softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. She always tried to be gentle, afraid that any movement might cause Ruth pain. "Could you bring me some water?" Ruth's request came out in short breaths. "And maybe sit with me for a while. I'm feeling a little lonely today." Olivia's heart clenched at Ruth's words, and she quickly nodded. "Of course. I'll be right back." As Olivia went to fetch the water, she felt the familiar pang of sadness creeping up on her. Ruth had once been a lively woman, filled with warmth and quiet humor. Now, she was a shadow of her former self, and Olivia couldn't help but think of what would happen when Ruth was gone. The thought made her stomach twist. She couldn't go back to the foster system. Not again. Not after knowing what it was like to have someone care about her. Returning with the water, Olivia sat beside Ruth, who took small sips, her hands shaking slightly as she held the glass. "Thank you, Olivia," Ruth whispered, her eyes half closed. "You're a good girl. I don't know what I'd do without you." Olivia smiled weakly, though the words weighed heavily on her. She didn't want to think about what either of them would do if things got worse. Later that night, after Ruth had fallen asleep, Olivia sat by the window, looking out at the dark street. A single street lamp flickered at the corner, casting long shadows across the pavement. The silence outside mirrored the loneliness she felt inside. Every night, it was the same. She would sit and think about her life, about Ruth, and about the future that seemed more uncertain with each passing day. She could hear the wind rustling through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. These were the sounds that kept her company, reminding her of the world beyond the walls of this house. But Olivia had never felt like she belonged in that world. It was as if life had forgotten her, just as her birth parents had when they left her behind. A soft knock on the door startled Olivia from her thoughts. It was unusual for anyone to visit this late, especially since Ruth's illness had kept visitors away. With a frown, Olivia opened the door slightly, peering out. To her surprise, a small dog sat on the porch, shivering in the cool night air. Its fur was matted, and it looked up at her with wide, pleading eyes. Olivia's heart softened. She stepped out onto the porch and crouched down, holding out her hand. The dog hesitated for a moment before inching closer, sniffing her fingers. "Hey there," Olivia whispered, her voice gentle. "Where did you come from?" She looked around but saw no sign of an owner. The street was empty, and the dog seemed lost. With a sigh, Olivia scooped the small creature into her arms and brought it inside, deciding she couldn't leave it out in the cold. As she placed the dog on a small blanket near the heater, Olivia couldn't help but feel a strange sense of connection with it. Like her, the dog had no one, no place to call home. It was a lonely soul in need of a little kindness, just as Olivia had been when Ruth took her in. For the first time in what felt like forever, Olivia allowed herself to smile. Perhaps in some small way, she and the dog could help each other. But as she sat there, watching the dog drift off to sleep, Olivia knew that the peace she felt in this moment was fleeting. Soon, she would have to face the harsh realities of her life once more. And in the quiet darkness of the night, Olivia prayed that somehow, things might change, that perhaps, in the vastness of the world, there was still a place for her. The next morning, Olivia woke up earlier than usual. The small dog she had brought inside last night was curled up at the foot of her bed, snoring softly. Olivia smiled at the sight, but as she stretched, her thoughts quickly shifted to Ruth. She crept out of bed quietly, not wanting to disturb the dog, and made her way to Ruth's room. The soft rays of early morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a gentle glow over Ruth's face. Olivia's foster mother looked peaceful in her sleep, but the shallowness of her breaths worried Olivia. Every day, Ruth seemed weaker, and Olivia could feel the inevitable creeping closer. "Please," Olivia whispered under her breath, though she wasn't sure who she was talking to. "Just give me more time with her." After checking on Ruth, Olivia made her way to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. As she stood at the counter, scrambling eggs, she heard a soft whimper behind her. The little dog had followed her and was now sitting by her feet, looking up at her with those big, round eyes. "You hungry?" she asked, as if the dog could understand her. It wagged its tail in response, and Olivia couldn't help but chuckle. She poured some leftover milk into a bowl and set it down on the floor. The dog eagerly lapped it up, and for a moment, Olivia allowed herself to feel a small sense of happiness in the otherwise heavy atmosphere of her life. Later that day, after making sure Ruth had everything she needed, Olivia decided to take a short walk. She needed some air, something to clear her mind. With the dog trotting alongside her, Olivia strolled through the quiet neighborhood. It was a modest area, with small houses lined up neatly on each side of the street, but the place always felt strangely empty. Few people ever ventured outside, and most days, the only sounds were the distant hum of cars or the occasional bark of a dog. As Olivia turned the corner, she noticed a sleek, black car parked near the entrance of the park. A woman was standing nearby, struggling with something near the trunk. The dog at her feet began to growl softly, its hackles rising as it sniffed the air. "Hey, it's okay," Olivia whispered, crouching down to soothe the animal. "There's nothing to be scared of." But before she could fully calm the dog, a high-pitched scream pierced the air. Olivia's heart leaped into her throat as she whipped her head around. A large dog, much bigger than the small one by her side, had lunged at a girl near the park's entrance. The girl was screaming, her hands flailing as she tried to push the dog away, but it was too strong. It snapped at her legs, and she stumbled back, panic written across her face. Without thinking, Olivia sprinted toward them. "Stop! Get away!" she shouted. But the dog seemed oblivious to her voice, too focused on its prey. The closer Olivia got, the more she could see the fear in the girl's eyes. Her clothes were torn, and tears streaked down her face as she tried to kick the dog off, but it held its ground, growling menacingly. Olivia's breath hitched as she reached them. She had no plan, no idea how to handle the situation, but she couldn't stand by and watch. She grabbed a nearby branch from the ground and swung it toward the dog with all her strength. The branch smacked against the animal's side, and it yelped in surprise, momentarily releasing the girl. "Run!" Olivia screamed at the girl, but she was frozen in place, staring wide-eyed at Olivia. The dog shook off the blow, and turned its snarling attention toward Olivia now. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but there was no time to think. She swung the branch again, more out of desperation than precision, and backed up slowly, hoping to lead the dog away from the girl. Suddenly, a loud voice cut through the chaos. "Get back!" It was a woman, the same one Olivia had seen earlier by the car. She rushed forward, pulling out a can of pepper spray from her purse and aiming it at the dog. The dog recoiled, whining as the spray hit its eyes, and with a few more angry barks, it turned tail and ran off into the distance. The park was silent again, save for the sound of labored breathing. Olivia stood still, her hands trembling around the branch, her mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice full of concern as she knelt beside the girl, who was still sitting on the ground, trembling. Olivia dropped the branch and approached them cautiously. The girl, who looked to be about her age, had stopped crying, but her face was pale, and she was clearly shaken. Her clothes were torn in places, and there were small scratches on her legs and arms, but nothing too serious. I'm okay," the girl finally whispered, looking up at her mother. It came out of nowhere." The woman wrapped her arms around her daughter, whispering soothing words before turning to Olivia with wide eyes. "Thank you," she breathed, her voice filled with gratitude. "If you hadn't stepped in when you did, I don't know what would have happened." Olivia shifted uncomfortably, not used to this kind of attention. "I just did what anyone would do," she mumbled, looking down at her feet. "No," the woman said firmly, standing up and placing a hand on Olivia's shoulder. "Not everyone would have acted so quickly, so bravely. You saved my daughter." Olivia finally looked up at the woman. She was tall and elegant, with striking features that immediately made her seem important. Her clothes were expensive, and there was an air of wealth around her, but her eyes were soft, full of warmth and gratitude. "I'm Sarah Thompson," the woman said, extending her hand. "This is my daughter, Jessica." Olivia blinked, suddenly realizing who they were. She had heard of the Thompsons, one of the richest families in the city. Their mansion wasn't far from the neighborhood, and their name was synonymous with power and influence. "I'm Olivia," she replied, hesitating before shaking Sarah's hand. "Well, Olivia," Sarah said, her voice soft but steady, "you're a hero. Is there anything I can do to thank you? Anything at all?" Olivia opened her mouth to speak but paused, her mind racing. She could ask for anything. Money, a favor, anything at all. But her thoughts quickly turned to Ruth, lying sick in bed at home, with no money for better treatment. After a long moment of silence, Olivia finally spoke. "There is something," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Can you help my foster mom? She's really sick, and we can't afford the treatment she needs." Sarah's eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. "Of course, I'll do everything I can." Jessica, still shaken, looked up at Olivia with newfound respect. "Thank you for saving me," she whispered. Olivia nodded, but her thoughts were already with Ruth. She had a chance now, a chance to help the only person who had ever cared for her. But something told her that this encounter with Sarah and Jessica would change her life in more ways than she could ever imagine. Over the next few days, Olivia found herself replaying the events of the dog attack in her head, almost as if it had been a dream. The chaos, the fear, and the relief that followed when Sarah Thompson had stepped in. But more than anything, what stuck with her was the offer Sarah had made to help her foster mother, Ruth. Olivia knew that she had to take Sarah up on that offer, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her simple life was about to change in ways she couldn't control. The first sign of this came the day after the incident, when Olivia returned from school to find an unfamiliar car parked outside her small house. It was sleek and black, the same one Sarah had driven that day in the park. Olivia's heart raced as she hurried inside, where she found Ruth in her usual spot on the couch, but sitting next to her was Sarah Thompson herself. Ruth looked up as Olivia entered, her tired eyes lighting up just a little. "Olivia, sweetheart, we have a visitor," she said softly, gesturing to Sarah. Sarah stood up, offering Olivia a warm smile. "I hope you don't mind me coming by," she said, her voice as polished and elegant as her appearance. I wanted to check in on your foster mother, Ruth, and see if I could help in any way." Olivia's throat tightened with a mix of anxiety and gratitude. She wasn't used to people, especially people like Sarah, stepping into her life so suddenly. I don't mind," she said quickly. "Thank you for coming." Sarah glanced around the modest living room, taking in the worn furniture and the general sense of fatigue that hung in the air. "Ruth's condition? It's quite serious," she said gently, her eyes meeting Olivia's with concern. "I've already spoken with a doctor I know, and they've agreed to review Ruth's case. There's a specialist in oncology who might be able to provide some options that weren't available before." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. "A specialist?" she repeated, almost in disbelief. Specialists were something she had only heard about on television or in stories, not something within reach for people like her and Ruth. Sarah nodded, her expression compassionate. "Yes, I've already arranged for Ruth to be transferred to a private clinic for further tests and treatments. They'll take care of her, and you won't have to worry about the cost. I'll cover everything." Olivia felt a wave of emotions crash over her. Relief, gratitude, and a strange mix of guilt. Ruth had been like a mother to her, and now a complete stranger was stepping in to help in ways Olivia could never have imagined. She wanted to thank Sarah, to tell her how much this meant, but the words got caught in her throat. Instead, she managed a quiet, "Thank you so much." Ruth, who had been silently observing the exchange, reached out and took Olivia's hand, squeezing it weakly. "This is more than I could have ever hoped for," Ruth whispered, her voice raspy. "You've been taking care of me for so long, Olivia. I'm so proud of you." Olivia blinked back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I'd do anything for you," she whispered back. In the weeks that followed, Ruth was moved to the private clinic, and the treatments began. Olivia visited her every day after school, sitting by her bedside, reading to her, or just holding her hand. Though Ruth's condition was still fragile, there was a sense of hope now, something that hadn't been there before. And during those visits, something else unexpected happened. Sarah and Jessica began to visit too. At first, Olivia was surprised by their presence, unsure of how to interact with them. Sarah was always polite, asking about Ruth's progress and speaking with the doctors in a way that Olivia couldn't. She was calm, composed, and always seemed to know the right thing to say. Olivia admired her, even though they came from completely different worlds. Jessica, on the other hand, was quiet at first, still shaken from the attack in the park. She would sit in the corner, avoiding eye contact with Olivia, as if unsure how to approach her. Olivia didn't blame her. After all, their lives couldn't have been more different. Jessica came from wealth, privilege, and security, while Olivia had spent most of her life scrambling for stability, never knowing if she'd have a home or someone to care for her. But then, one afternoon, while they both sat in Ruth's hospital room, Jessica finally broke the silence. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Olivia looked up from the book she was reading to Ruth, confused. "Do what?" "Save me," Jessica said, her eyes wide and sincere. "That dog, it could have hurt you too. But you didn't even think twice. You just jumped in." Olivia shrugged, feeling uncomfortable under Jessica's gaze. "You needed help," she said simply. "I didn't think about it." "But you didn't even know me," Jessica pressed, her brow furrowed. "You could have gotten hurt." Olivia sighed, closing the book in her lap. "Look, I don't know why I did it, okay? It just felt like the right thing to do." Jessica fell silent for a moment, chewing on her bottom lip as she considered Olivia's words. Then, to Olivia's surprise, Jessica's lips curved into a small smile. "Well, thank you," she said softly. "I've never met anyone like you before." Olivia blinked in surprise. "Like me?" "Yeah," Jessica said, her smile widening a little. "You're brave and kind. I don't know anyone like that in my world." Olivia laughed, though it was more out of disbelief than anything. "I'm not brave. I was just scared. That's all." Jessica shook her head. "I don't believe that. You're a lot braver than you think." From that moment on, something shifted between them. Jessica started visiting Ruth's room more often, staying longer, and talking to Olivia more freely. At first, their conversations were awkward, stilted. But slowly they began to find common ground. Olivia was surprised to learn that Jessica, despite all her wealth and privilege, was just as lonely as she was. Her mother, Sarah, was always busy with work and charity events, and her father had left when she was young. Jessica had grown up surrounded by luxury, but she had never had the kind of closeness or connection that Olivia had found with Ruth. As days turned into weeks, an unlikely friendship began to form between them. Jessica would bring Olivia snacks from the expensive cafe near the hospital, insisting that she needed to try real food, while Olivia would tease Jessica about her obsession with designer shoes. They were from two different worlds, but somehow, those differences began to matter less and less. One day, while they were sitting in the hospital garden, Jessica looked over at Olivia, her expression serious. "You know," she began, "my mom thinks of you as a hero." Olivia shook her head, laughing softly. "I'm no hero." "Yes, you are," Jessica insisted. "You saved me, and now you're saving Ruth too. If it weren't for you, we wouldn't even be here." Olivia paused, her smile fading slightly. "It's not just me. Your mom is the one helping Ruth. I'm just trying to keep things together." Jessica leaned forward, her gaze intense. "And that's exactly why you're a hero. You don't give up. You just keep going, even when things are hard." Olivia didn't know how to respond to that. She had spent her whole life feeling invisible, like she didn't matter. But here was Jessica, someone who had everything, telling her that she was brave, that she was important. It was strange, but for the first time in a long while, Olivia felt seen. "Thanks," Olivia mumbled, unsure of what else to say. Jessica smiled. "I mean it. You're stronger than you know." As they sat together in the garden, a quiet understanding passed between them. Their lives had crossed in the most unexpected way, and though they were different in so many ways, they had found something rare, a true connection. For Olivia, it was the first time she had ever felt like she belonged, and for Jessica, it was the first time she had ever had a real friend. The days continued to pass, and Olivia's life began to settle into a strange, new routine. Ruth's condition had stabilized under the care of the specialists Sarah had arranged, and while Olivia still worried, there was now a glimmer of hope where before there had only been fear. Between school, hospital visits, and her growing friendship with Jessica, Olivia found herself less isolated than she had ever been. But even as this new chapter of her life unfolded, there was a quiet tension that neither she nor Jessica could fully understand. It started with Sarah. Though she had always been kind to Olivia, offering help and guidance, Sarah had grown more distant in recent days. She spent long stretches on the phone, her voice hushed and serious, and whenever Olivia or Jessica would ask what was going on, Sarah would brush them off with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. One afternoon, while Olivia was at the hospital with Ruth, she noticed Sarah in the hallway, deep in conversation with a man Olivia didn't recognize. He was tall, with sharp features and a serious expression, and Sarah seemed unusually tense as she spoke with him. Olivia watched from a distance, her curiosity piqued. There was something off about the way Sarah glanced around, as if she didn't want anyone to overhear. When Sarah noticed Olivia standing there, she quickly ended the conversation and walked over, her face tight with an uneasy smile. "Oh, Olivia," she said, trying to sound casual. "I didn't see you there. How's Ruth doing?" "She's stable," Olivia replied, still eyeing the man who was now walking away. "Who was that?" Sarah's smile faltered for a brief second, but she recovered quickly. "Just someone I know from work," she said, her tone dismissive. "Nothing to worry about." But Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something was being kept from her. Sarah had never acted like this before. She had always been upfront, even when discussing Ruth's treatment or offering to help Olivia in ways that made her uncomfortable. But now, there was a new distance, a wall that Olivia didn't understand. Later that evening, back at home, Olivia sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker to life. The small dog she had taken in weeks ago was curled up in her lap, snoring softly. Normally, the quiet would have been a comfort, but tonight it only heightened the sense of unease gnawing at her. Jessica had called earlier, her voice excited as she asked Olivia to meet her at the hospital the next day. "I've got something to show you," she had said, her tone full of anticipation. But even Jessica's enthusiasm hadn't been enough to shake Olivia from her growing anxiety. There was something wrong. She could feel it in her bones. The next day, Olivia arrived at the hospital to find Jessica waiting for her outside Ruth's room, practically bouncing on her heels with excitement. "You won't believe what I found," Jessica said, grabbing Olivia's hand and pulling her toward the elevator. "Where are we going?" Olivia asked, slightly bewildered by Jessica's sudden energy. "To the records room," Jessica whispered conspiratorially. "I overheard my mom talking to some guy the other day, and she mentioned something about Ruth's past. I think there's more to this than she's telling us." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What does Ruth's past have to do with anything?" "I don't know yet," Jessica admitted, "but I want to find out." Despite her better judgment, Olivia followed Jessica down the hall and into the hospital's records room. The dimly lit space was filled with shelves upon shelves of old files and papers, the scent of dust thick in the air. Jessica led Olivia to a computer in the corner, where she quickly began typing, her eyes scanning the screen as she searched for something specific. "Here," Jessica muttered after a few minutes. "Look at this." Olivia leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she read the information on the screen. It was a birth record, but not just any birth record. It was Ruth's. "I don't understand," Olivia said, confused. "What does this have to do with anything?" Jessica scrolled down, her finger hovering over a specific line of text. "Look here. It says Ruth had a daughter, but there's no record of her after that. It's like she just disappeared." Olivia's stomach turned. "But I'm Ruth's foster daughter. She's never mentioned having a real child." "I know," Jessica said, her voice hushed. "That's what's so strange. Why wouldn't she tell you?" Before Olivia could respond, the sound of the door creaking open made both girls freeze. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. "What are you doing here?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jessica stood up quickly, her eyes darting nervously between Olivia and her mother. We found something, Mom." "About Ruth." Sarah's face tightened, and for a moment, Olivia thought she saw a flicker of fear cross her features. "You shouldn't be in here," Sarah said, her voice low. "There are things you don't understand." Olivia felt her pulse quicken. "What things? What are you not telling us?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes locking with Olivia's for a long, tense moment. Then, with a heavy sigh, she closed the door behind her and walked toward them. "I didn't want it to come out this way," she said quietly, her voice tinged with regret. "But I suppose it was only a matter of time." Olivia and Jessica exchanged confused glances. "Come with me," Sarah said, gesturing for them to follow her out of the records room. "There's something you both need to know." In the quiet confines of the hospital's private lounge, Sarah sat down across from Olivia and Jessica, her expression grave. For a long moment, she didn't speak, as if gathering the strength to say what needed to be said. "This isn't easy for me to explain," Sarah began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "But the truth is, Ruth is connected to both of you in a way you never imagined." Olivia's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean?" Sarah took a deep breath. "When you were born, Olivia, you weren't an orphan. You had a family, a twin sister." Olivia blinked, her mind struggling to process the words. "A twin? But I've never—" "You and Jessica are those twins," Sarah interrupted, her voice soft but steady. "You were separated at birth." Jessica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What? How is that even possible?" Sarah leaned forward, her eyes filled with sorrow. "There was a mix-up at the maternity hospital. When Ruth gave birth, there were complications, and in the chaos, the two of you were sent to different families. Jessica was adopted by me, and Olivia, you were placed in the foster system." Olivia felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her. Her entire life had been a lie. She wasn't just some abandoned child. She had a family, a sister, and all this time, she had been living in the shadow of a mistake. "But why?" Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "Because no one knew," Sarah explained, her voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't until I started looking into Ruth's past, trying to help her with her medical bills, that I discovered the truth. I didn't know how to tell you. I was afraid of how it would change everything. Jessica, who had been silently absorbing the revelation, finally spoke. So, we're sisters? Sarah nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Yes, you were meant to grow up together, but fate separated you. Olivia sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Everything she had known about herself, about her life, had just been turned upside down. She had a twin sister, and that twin was Jessica, the girl she had saved in the park, the girl she had grown to care about as a friend. Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes as the enormity of the truth settled in. Why didn't Ruth tell me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't know, Sarah said softly. The hospital never told her what happened. They just said her baby was gone, and she believed it. It wasn't until I uncovered the records that the truth came to light. Jessica reached out, taking Olivia's hand in hers. I can't believe this, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. All this time, we were supposed to be together. Olivia squeezed Jessica's hand, her heart pounding in her chest. The truth had been hidden from them for so long, but now it was out in the open. They were sisters, long-lost twins, separated by a mistake that had cost them years of their lives together. And now, with the truth revealed, they had to figure out what it all meant. The air in the hospital lounge was thick with tension. Olivia's mind raced as she tried to process everything Sarah had just revealed. The quiet hum of the hospital felt distant, drowned out by the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She had spent her entire life believing she was alone, an orphan with no real family. And now, in an instant, everything had changed. Jessica sat beside her, equally stunned. Her hand remained in Olivia's, their fingers intertwined, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they never knew they shared. For the first time, Olivia saw Jessica not as the privileged girl she had come to know over the past few weeks, but as her sister, her twin. It was an overwhelming realization, one that filled Olivia with both confusion and a strange, unfamiliar sense of belonging. I don't understand, Olivia finally whispered, her voice trembling. Why would the hospital do something like this? How could they let us be separated like that? Sarah sighed, her expression one of deep regret. It wasn't intentional, Olivia. From what I've been able to uncover, there was a mix-up during the chaos of Ruth's delivery. The hospital was overwhelmed, and mistakes were made. You were placed in the foster system by accident. Jessica was adopted by me, but no one realized you were both part of the same family. It was a terrible, tragic mistake. Olivia shook her head, struggling to comprehend it all. But why didn't Ruth know? How could they not tell her? Sarah looked down, guilt flashing across her face. They told Ruth that her baby had died during the complications. That's what she's believed all these years. Olivia's heart clenched painfully. Ruth had thought she was dead? It was too much to bear. The idea that Ruth, the only person who had ever cared for her, had spent her life mourning a child she didn't even know had survived. Jessica's voice broke through the silence. So, all this time, you knew? She asked, her gaze locked on her mother. Her voice was calm, but Olivia could hear the undercurrent of hurt in her tone. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I only found out recently, she said quietly. When I started looking into Ruth's medical history to help with her treatment, I came across the old records. I didn't know what to do. I was afraid of how it would affect both of you. Jessica's eyes narrowed, and she pulled her hand away from Olivia, turning to face her mother fully. You didn't think we deserved to know the truth? You didn't think Olivia deserved to know she had a sister? Sarah's face crumpled with guilt. I was going to tell you, I swear. I didn't know how. I didn't want to hurt either of you. Hurt us. Jessica's voice rose, her anger barely contained. You let us live our entire lives not knowing about each other. Olivia's been through so much, and you didn't say a word? What gave you the right to decide when we deserve to know? Sarah flinched at Jessica's words, her eyes filling with tears. I didn't want to lose you, Jessica, she whispered. I thought you'd hate me. Jessica stood up, pacing the small room as her emotions boiled over. Hate you? I don't know what to feel right now, she cried, her voice cracking. You kept something like this from me, from both of us. I have a sister, and you didn't think I deserved to know? Olivia watched the exchange in stunned silence, her heart aching for both of them. She could see the pain in Sarah's eyes, the fear that she had kept hidden behind her polished, controlled exterior. But she also understood Jessica's anger. This was a betrayal, a deep, personal betrayal that cut to the core of who they were. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper now. "I thought I was protecting you." Jessica stopped pacing, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Protecting me from what? From my own sister? From the truth?" She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "You've always controlled everything, always made decisions for me. But this wasn't your choice to make." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Sarah sat there, her shoulders slumped in defeat, while Jessica stood rigid, her face flushed with anger and hurt. Olivia felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. The truth about her past, the years of separation, the betrayal. But beneath it, there was something else. She wasn't sure if it was anger or sadness or something more complicated, but it was raw and overwhelming. "I don't know what to say," Olivia murmured, breaking the silence. "I've spent my whole life thinking I didn't have anyone. I thought I was alone." She looked over at Jessica, her voice softening. "But now I have a sister, and I don't know how to feel about that either." Jessica wiped at her eyes, her expression softening as she met Olivia's gaze. "I didn't know either," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "But now that I do, I don't want to lose you." The vulnerability in Jessica's voice struck Olivia deeply. Despite everything, despite the secrets and the betrayal, Olivia couldn't deny the connection she felt with Jessica. It was like a piece of her she hadn't known was missing had suddenly been found. But there was still the matter of Sarah. Olivia looked at her, sitting there in quiet agony, and felt torn. She didn't know what to think of Sarah now. The woman who had helped her save Ruth, who had brought her into her world, had also kept the most important truth from her. "Why didn't you tell Ruth?" Olivia asked, her voice low. "She thought I was dead all this time." Sarah closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I didn't know how. I thought, after all she's been through, finding out the truth might hurt her even more." Olivia's chest tightened. "She deserves to know," she whispered. "I deserve to know." Sarah nodded, wiping her tears. "You're right. Both of you deserve the truth. And I'll tell Ruth. I'll make it right, I promise." Jessica sat down beside Olivia again, her anger fading into exhaustion. "We can't change what happened," she said softly, "but we can figure out where to go from here." Olivia nodded, her mind still spinning. Everything had changed so quickly. The life she thought she knew had been turned upside down, but there was one thing she was certain of now. She wasn't alone anymore. "We need to tell Ruth together," Olivia said, her voice firm. "She needs to know the truth, and we need to do it right." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with remorse. "I'll arrange everything." That evening, as Olivia returned to Ruth's hospital room, the weight of the truth sat heavily on her shoulders. Ruth lay in bed, her frail body cocooned in soft blankets, her eyes closed as she slept peacefully. Olivia sat down beside her, watching the gentle rise and fall of Ruth's chest, wondering how much longer she could carry the burden of not knowing. As Olivia sat there, her thoughts drifting between the past and the uncertain future, the door opened softly behind her. Jessica stepped in, her expression tentative as she took a seat beside Olivia. "I don't know what's going to happen next," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I want to be a part of your life, Olivia. I don't want to lose you again." Olivia looked at her sister, her twin, and saw the same uncertainty in her eyes. They had been kept apart for so long, separated by a mistake they couldn't undo. But now they had a chance to start over, to build the relationship they had been denied. "I want that too," Olivia whispered back. "But it's going to take time." Jessica nodded, her hand reaching out to hold Olivia's once more. "We'll figure it out. Together." As the two sisters sat in the quiet room, the truth hung between them, heavy but undeniable. It was painful, and it had shaken the foundations of their lives. But there was also hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal. And for the first time, Olivia didn't feel so alone. The days following the revelation were a whirlwind of emotion for Olivia. Ruth's condition was improving, but the weight of the truth still hung heavily over her. Olivia knew that the conversation with Ruth couldn't be delayed any longer. Ruth deserved to know about her lost daughter and the life Olivia had unknowingly lived as part of a fractured family. But how would Ruth react? How would she feel about the years lost, the daughter she had never known? Olivia, Jessica, and Sarah sat together one morning in Ruth's hospital room, a quiet tension settling over them like a heavy fog. Ruth was resting, her eyes closed, but Olivia knew she wasn't asleep. She had become more aware lately, more observant, as if she could sense that something was wrong, that something important was about to change. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to gently touch Ruth's arm. "Ruth," she began softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "There's something you need to know. Something that I've kept from you for too long." Ruth opened her eyes slowly, her gaze moving from Sarah to Olivia, and finally to Jessica, who stood nervously beside Olivia. "What is it, dear?" Ruth asked, her voice weak but alert. "You all look so serious." Olivia swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ruth, you remember when you told me about the day I came into your life? How I was placed with you as a foster child?" Ruth nodded, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Of course, I remember. You were so small, so full of life. I've always thought of you as my own." Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes, but she blinked them away. "There's something we found out, something we didn't know before." Ruth's eyes searched Olivia's face, and she reached out to take her hand. "What is it, child?" Sarah took over, her voice filled with regret. "Ruth, when you gave birth all those years ago, something went terribly wrong. There was a mix-up at the hospital, and you were told that your baby had passed away during the complications." Ruth's face went pale, her eyes wide with shock. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Olivia squeezed Ruth's hand, her own voice trembling as she continued. "Ruth, I'm that baby. I'm your daughter. I didn't die. I was placed in the foster system by mistake." Ruth's mouth fell open, and for a moment, she simply stared at Olivia, as if trying to make sense of the words she had just heard. Her hand tightened around Olivia's, and she let out a soft gasp. You're my daughter," she whispered, her voice breaking with disbelief. Olivia nodded, tears now spilling freely down her cheeks. "Yes, it's me. I didn't know either. But I'm your daughter, Ruth." Ruth's breath hitched, and her frail body shook with emotion. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at Olivia, her face a mixture of sorrow and joy. "All these years," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought you were gone. I thought I had lost you." Olivia leaned forward, wrapping her arms around Ruth's fragile frame. "You didn't lose me," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm here. I've always been here." Ruth clung to Olivia, her sobs quiet but full of years of pain and grief finally released. For so long, she had believed that her child was gone, that the life she had once imagined was lost. And now, in this moment, she realized that her daughter had been by her side all along. After a long while, Ruth pulled back slightly, her tear-streaked face filled with love as she gazed at Olivia. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. "Not for a moment." Olivia nodded, her own tears falling freely. "I know, Ruth. I know." Jessica, who had been watching quietly, stepped forward, her own eyes red with unshed tears. "Ruth," she began, her voice soft, "there's something else. I'm your daughter too." Ruth blinked, confusion flickering across her face. What do you mean?" Sarah spoke up, her voice gentle. "Jessica is Olivia's twin sister, Ruth. They were separated at birth, but they were meant to grow up together. Jessica, she's your other daughter." The room fell silent as Ruth tried to absorb the enormity of what she had just been told. Her gaze moved slowly from Olivia to Jessica, her eyes filled with wonder and disbelief. "Both of you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're both my daughters?" Jessica nodded, stepping closer to the bed. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're both your daughters, Ruth." "We're sisters." Ruth's face crumpled as tears streamed down her cheeks. She reached out, taking Jessica's hand in one of hers and holding Olivia's in the other. "I never imagined," she whispered. "All this time, I thought I had lost one child, and now I find out I have two." The three of them sat together, their hands intertwined, as the weight of the truth settled over them. It was a moment of profound connection, a moment that erased the years of separation and loss. They were together now, a family that had been fractured by fate but was now whole again. In the weeks that followed, Olivia, Jessica, and Ruth began to build a new life together. The past was still painful, the years lost, the moments that could never be recovered, but they were determined not to let those years define them. They had found each other again, and that was what mattered now. Ruth's health continued to improve, and though she was still frail, there was a new light in her eyes, a sense of peace that had not been there before. She had her daughters by her side, and that gave her the strength to keep fighting. Olivia and Jessica spent more and more time together, deepening the bond that had been hidden from them for so long. They laughed, shared stories, and discovered how much they had in common despite their vastly different upbringings. There were moments of awkwardness, moments where the reality of their separation weighed heavily on them, but they faced it together, determined to never let anything come between them again. Sarah, too, was part of this new chapter. Though the initial anger Jessica had felt toward her mother had not fully disappeared, the two of them were working through it, slowly rebuilding the trust that had been damaged. Sarah had made a mistake, but she was trying to make amends, and Jessica could see that. One day, as Olivia and Jessica sat in the hospital garden with Ruth, enjoying the warmth of the sun on their faces, Olivia turned to her sister with a small smile. "I never thought I'd say this," she said softly, "but I'm glad we found each other." Jessica smiled back, her eyes bright with emotion. "Me too," she whispered. "I can't imagine my life without you now." Ruth, sitting between them, reached out and took both of their hands, her heart full. "I never thought I'd get to see this," she said, her voice soft but steady. "My girls, together." Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes as she looked at Ruth and Jessica, the two people who had come to mean everything to her. She had spent so many years believing she was alone, but now, she knew the truth. She had a family. A real, imperfect, messy, but deeply loving family. And as they sat there together, the sun shining down on them, Olivia knew that no matter what challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. She wasn't alone anymore. She never would be again. Love thrilling stories with unexpected twists and emotional drama? Subscribe now for more gripping narratives that will keep you on the edge of your seat.